I want to welcome everyone to this special webinar hosted by the Whale Sanctuary Project. I'm Lori Marino, the president of the Whale Sanctuary Project. And today I have a very special guest, and we're going to talk about the ongoing cutting edge issue of rights for other animals, and specifically for dolphins and whales. And we're going to be talking about concepts that are now concepts that a few years ago you couldn't even talk about in terms of other animals. And now we are at the point where we're looking at the concept of fundamental rights, personhood, flourishing, both morally and legally. And it's a very exciting time for making those shifts in society. So let me introduce Tom. Tom White is the author of 6 books and numerous articles on a number of topics that range from contemporary applied ethics to 16th century Renaissance humanism. So you are a Renaissance man. And Tom has served as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in 2007 and 8, Year of the Dolphin Program, and he's a fellow of the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. He's also a member of the advisory committee to my other organization, the Camella Center for Animal Advocacy, and scientific advisor to the Wild Dolphin Project. So Tom's main research is on the philosophical and ethical implications of scientific research on whales and dolphins. And he argues that such practices as captivity and the deaths and injuries of dolphins in connection with various practices around the world, including attempts to bring back commercial whaling, are all ethically indefensible. In 2007, he published this seminal work entitled In Defense of Dolphins, and I know that it's backwards here, but you can at least see the cover, The New Moral Frontier, in which he laid out his arguments for more ethical treatment for dolphins. I want to welcome Tom and thank you for being on this webinar.
Well, thanks for letting me be here. It's always an honor for me to be involved. I will always know that my place, is kind of on the sideline. I'm a philosopher. I am not a marine mammal scientist. The trajectory of my work has been to try to explain, as Laurie mentioned, I do contemporary applied ethics. So this is to try to explain how the scientific research that has been done, the discoveries about the various capacities, traits of cetaceans, how they define and describe a kind of being that we historically say needs to be treated differently than chairs and tables. And so that's how I kind of got to where I am now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, one of the things that's really interesting, we maybe can get into this right now, is you mentioned the concept of flourishing. Some people use the concept of thriving or flourishing. They mean something very similar. But let's get right into it. Let's talk about that. And you're one of the few philosophers who actually has a tremendous amount of experience watching your subject, in this case, dolphins, flourishing in the wild. And as I've told the story many times, I've worked with captive dolphins a lot. I never understood really who they are until I did some field work and saw them flourishing in the wild, because then you really get it. You understand who they are. And you need to see that and experience that in order to really understand what flourishing means for these animals. So let's get into it. The concept of flourishing is really key to a rights-based argument for dolphins and whales. How should we think about flourishing? Can you describe what you mean by that?
Sure. Well, first of all, the point that Laurie just made about the difference between captive, or when you see captive dolphins, when you see dolphins in their natural habitat, the difference is enormous. I mean, the best simple phrase I've heard of that, as Denise Herzing says, that dolphins in captivity, it's a shadow of a dolphin. It's not a dolphin. It's basically sort of the shadow. And when you first experience what they're like in their environment, it's a huge difference. I mean, you can't describe the difference. It's just enormous. But what it's a reminder of is that we are the way we are, and any animal is the way they are, because of an evolutionary history and how that being has over time progressed and adapted to an environment in a way to be able to survive and to lead a full life. Flourishing is simply a kind of shorthand way of talking about and with thriving, it's the same notion. So whether we see this talked about in different sort of animal ethics discussions, in marine mammal science, in philosophy, whether it's flourishing or thriving, it's really the same sort of thing. But what we're talking about are, and like when we talk about the conditions necessary for flourishing, we're talking about the conditions necessary for a being, given its evolutionary history, to be able to have even a rudimentary opportunity to have a successful life as the member of that species. The problem with captivity is that, and there's no way that dolphins in those situations can live a full, satisfied life, because that's not where they evolved. In the same way that in humans, the kinds of conditions that we need in order to grow, to develop, to have some sense of satisfaction in life, to have some opportunity to have the kind of life that's defined by the nature of our species, that's all defined by evolutionary history. And the transition from that to ethics is that, as I tell my students when I teach ethics, this is a way of talking about ethics which gives it a biological foundation. When we talk about, if we say, okay, how do you determine whether or not something is right or wrong? I say, look, the simplest way and most practical way of talking about this is, if an action makes it, sort of advances the likelihood that members of our species are going to be able to have a fuller and satisfying life, that means that, I'd say, okay, that's a shorthand way of, that's a long way of saying something is right. If an action is going to get in the way of growth, development, flourishing, and the kind of conditions we need to be that, then it's wrong. The notion of a right is simply, in my mind, a shorthand way of talking about, sort of referring to conditions that are necessary for beings, and it's already sort of defined in terms of evolutionary history, for beings to be able to grow, develop in a way that is consistent with their capacities, emotional capacities, intellectual capacities, cultural capacities, social capacities, to grow and develop in a full and healthy fashion. As I said, to be able to have even an opportunity for a successful life as a member of that species. Now, the whole point of this is this takes this out of the realm of someone saying, gee, that's not my opinion. I just think da 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 da. I don't think, dolphins should be treated that way. Or if you say, I don't think humans should be treated that way. Most of this just is no longer, despite what people like to say about ethics, which is, oh, it's a matter of opinion. Most of the time, no, it's not. Now, this is an empirical question. We can identify the conditions that have to be met under which human beings grow, develop, flourish, have an opportunity, develop emotionally, intellectually, in order to have a full and satisfying life, and at least an opportunity to be successful as a member of that species. We can point to those. That's all empirical. We're just doing the same thing now here with cetaceans. When you look at what they need in the wild, that's where that species evolved, and longer than we've been in our species. When you say, what are the conditions from the evolutionary history that we can see of those species, what is it that they need in order to have physical health, emotional health, social interaction, and all the rest. And we know from now years of research, the capacities they have are roughly equivalent to the same capacities that we have, intellectually, emotionally, socially, culturally, and on down the line. Yeah, they're absolutely different species. And so that's why we then talk about rights as a sort of species specific fashion.
Right.
It isn't rights sort of, I mean, we say rights, yeah, but this is related to, these are connected to particular evolutionary histories and conditions that can be empirically verified for what you need for health and growth and the like. And so that's where as I said, that's where this gets grounded in biology. It gets grounded in science. It's empirical. Ethics then becomes the way that I talk about it, a kind of shorthand way of talking about the connection between particular actions, say captivity of a dolphin, and what we know beings of that sort need in order to have a successful life. So when Laurie talks about you see dolphins in captivity, you see dolphins in the wild, it is dramatically different, because in the one situation, you're talking about a life that is absolutely barren of the kind of stimulation and the kind of conditions they need in order to have a life in which they grow, develop, and the like. And this is not just a matter of lifespan. This is in every way, because we're complicated beings. And that then becomes, when we talk about rights, it's a matter of saying, okay, yeah, when you look then at dolphins in the wild, you see they are getting more of what they need. And so for me, it's just always, it's just a better for instead of people talking about rights, to talk about, even if it's longer, the conditions that are necessary for beings of that sort, with an evolutionary history of that sort, the conditions that are necessary for the various kinds of growth and development that are possible given the nature of that species.
So well put. And I think, there's two ways of looking at this. One way is that the way you described, and there's two levels here, is one is, are those animals being forced to live under conditions that they're not adapted to? And, if you're living in a tank and you're an orca or some other kind of dolphin, the answer is no. And there's that issue. And as you said, that's an empirical issue. That is a comparison between how this animal is living and how this animal was adapted to live, period.
And when you talk about adaptation, think of the amount of time it takes for adaptation to take place. I mean, every now and then people will say, well, gee, can't dolphins adapt to captivity? Well, I don't know, given 1,000,000 years, 100,000 years, I was like, evolution moves slowly. Think of all the ways in which humans still possess traits that were adaptive, that are now maladaptive. And one of my favorite examples, which everybody knows about, diet. We evolved in a way to like stuff that was scarce at a certain time, that now we can have all that we want, and it's absolutely maladaptive to, have fat and sugar as sort of central parts of our diet. Adaptation moves really slowly. So if you say, well, gee, can't dolphins adapt to well, certainly not during the lifetime of any generation or 5. And this just takes a huge amount of time. It's sort of always the wrong question, because it's you then because you get to say, even if that were possible, what about the welfare of the dolphins that we're talking about right now? They're alive. They deserve certain conditions. And so, it really doesn't matter if 3-4 generations down the road, those dolphins, may not be suffering as, dolphins in captivity may not be suffering as much. It's a matter of, from an ethical standpoint, you get to say, look, every being counts. And this is one of the most important things, and the kind of research that Laurie has done in the past, demonstrating the fact that we're talking about beings with self-awareness, self-consciousness. They're individuals, and individuals count. Individual dolphins count. It isn't just populations, it isn't groups, it's individuals.
Right. And that's really speaks to the fact that, a lot of people think that the dolphin is born in captivity, that somehow they are adapted to captivity. And the welfare science tells us otherwise. It tells us that these animals who were born in captivity, these individuals, do just as poorly, if not worse, when they're born into the tanks as those captured from the wild. And that tells you empirically that they're not adapted to living in the tanks. There are no domesticated dolphins on the planet. And I think that's the other thing, the point about welfare and well-being. We have all the empirical evidence that tells us that these animals are not adapted to living in captivity because they don't live very long. The quality of life is very poor, and the things that you see in terms of what they die from and what they suffer in terms of behavioral disorders, et cetera, all point to the same thing, that this is not an environment that allows them to thrive or flourish.
And I think that, I mean, that's a really important point as it relates to, you know, when people say, oh, but don't they live reasonably long in captivity? Now, it's true that dolphins in some ways can adjust to bad circumstances in the same way that human beings can adjust to bad circumstances. You know, human beings, as a rule, like certain conditions in order to thrive, to flourish, to have a satisfying life. One of the things that human beings have evolved to like is individuality and making choices. Hence, you see humans always making a big deal about freedom. Now, it is true that human beings can adapt to servitude for a while, but eventually, no matter where you look, people get so angry that because it is such a deep need, that what they do is they will revolt. They will put their lives on the line to get this need. That's kind of built into the way that we have evolved. So we can adjust for a certain amount of time, and some people will do it their whole life. Some people will adjust to poor conditions, but you know, just because people are adjusting to poor conditions doesn't mean that the internal experience that they're having is a satisfying one and is consistent with, you know, the kinds of needs that have to be met in order to grow and develop. And exactly the same thing is true then of cetaceans.
Exactly. They're individuals.
They may be able to adapt to unsatisfying conditions. It doesn't mean it's a good life.
Right, exactly. There's no flourishing under those conditions. There may be individuals who could cope better than others, and like you said, eke out some kind of an existence. But it is due to individual differences in resilience and so forth. But that doesn't mean it's a good life. I want to turn to something that we did about 12 years ago in 2010. We went to Helsinki, Finland.
Oh, yes.
And we met with a bunch of other people, Hal Whitehead, Philippa Breaks. It was a meeting that was put together by the Whale and Dolphin Conservation. And in that meeting, we created something called the Declaration of Rights for Cetaceans. And it was published online by Philippa Breaks. And if you Google Declaration of Rights for Cetaceans, you will find it and information about the meeting and so forth. And, you know, while the declaration is there, our task now is to give it some teeth, to enact some of the issues that it discusses. And I thought a good way to frame, you know, the next part of our discussion would be to talk about some of the points in the declaration and exemplify what we mean by species-specific rights and fundamental rights. And I'll just talk about these, and perhaps we can then identify some of the ways that we can frame those rights. So this webinar is about the 5 fundamental rights of dolphins or cetaceans. And in that Declaration of Rights, Tom and I and others put forth several. The 5 are the right to life and bodily liberty, bodily integrity, excuse me. In other words, not to be subjected to invasive treatment of any kind. The second is the right to bodily freedom and residence within your natural environment, so not to be subjected to captivity or servitude. The third is the right not to be owned or be the property of any human group or state or corporation or even individual. The fourth is the right to protection of your natural environment. And the fifth, which is very interesting and very appropriate for dolphins and whales, is the right to protection of your culture, because we know dolphins and whales are highly cultural beings. And the protection of culture, culture is for cultural beings, the way in which individuals thrive and frame their life. So we've laid out these 5 fundamental rights for dolphins and whales. I'd like to talk a little bit about what they mean and how we are violating or protecting those rights in the world. And that includes not just talking about captivity, but how do we treat dolphins and whales who are in the wild, and some of the things that we do currently to them that go even beyond violating their bodily liberty.
Well, I think the best place to start is where we're really just talking about anything related to the fact that dolphins are individuals, that we're talking about self-awareness, that we're talking about beings with the kind of sophisticated intellectual and emotional capacities that have them being autonomous. They make their own decisions, they make choices. Whales and dolphins are, their actions are not instinctive. They're the result of choice in the same way that human beings are, and other kind of advanced primates. It's a matter of choice. And so one of the first things is we have to say, well, what are the conditions under which beings of that sort, individuals who make self-reflective decisions, what are the conditions that need to be respected? And sort of the basics are, well, you have to leave them alone, for them to be alive. They have to be physically healthy. They have to be recognized as individuals. And so it isn't just a matter of, the group that they belong to, that the welfare, but it's what are the conditions that have to be met for beings of all of that sort as individuals, as members of a group. And I want to kind of skip down a bit to the issue of culture, because that becomes extremely important when you're talking about beings like dolphins. The point of culture is to transmit information. It gives us a sense, sure, culture gives us a sense of belonging at the time, so that's part of it. We have a sense of community, but most importantly, from an evolutionary standpoint, culture transmits information from one generation to another about how to survive. When we talk about flourishing, it's you're an advanced, sophisticated being in a particular environment. How do you manage to stay alive? How do you manage to function in your group? How do you get it possible for your children to survive and for your species to continue on? Well, one of the most important ways is information gets transmitted from one generation to another. Now with humans, we do a lot of that through books. We do a lot of that through other sorts of, the kind of human language that we have. Dolphins have their own way of transmitting information. And I can't remember which species of whale it is. I want to say right whale, but I might be wrong. But I know Hal Whitehead at one point has documented the fact that one of the consequences of whaling was that there's a part of, now, unless things have bounced back, but I don't think so. And I'm not an expert in this, so I defer to anyone else who knows more on this. But I recall reading something that Hal wrote at one point, that there was a part of the Atlantic that got so the whales who lived there got so wiped out that it was not basically, it was a viable area for whales to live, but the area got wiped out. All the whales who carried the information about how to survive and to pass that along got hunted, and the information never got passed on about how to live successfully in that part of the ocean. That means when you say, oh, extinction, people being, whales being killed, you have to appreciate the fact that part of the ethical significance of this is when you kill off the information, the ability for the information to be transferred, that's a generational consequence. You're talking about long-term consequence, not just individuals, but beings of the kind of sort that we are, the kind of that whales and dolphins are, beings that take a while to mature. One of the things that you have to have is a mechanism for communicating information, and which is culture. And so, for me, one of the things that people have sort of resisted the hardest on as for significance is the notion of, well, the culture of cetaceans. It's like they get okay with, okay, I can kind of understand personhood.
Yeah.
I can understand health and safety and emotional well-being. I can understand family, but culture, no, culture is just kind of a nice add-on. No, culture is absolutely central. So one of the most significant things of the document that I think we did in Helsinki was to appreciate the fact that one of the long-term consequences that human behavior, human treatment of whales has been, is that it poses an absolutely perplexing question of, is there some harm you can't undo?
Mhm.
Because we didn't know we were doing it, so it's not like it was done intentionally. But now, from an ethical standpoint, if you do that kind of harm, don't you have some responsibility to try to make it right? Minimally, you don't do it again. So it does become critical. And as I said, I pointed this example of Hal, and Hal has written a lot about culture and in
Absolutely.
whales.
He and Luke Rendell
And yeah,
others.
and so, but it's very important to understand the practical long-term consequences, the kind of work that scientists like that are doing, because we really did badly about that sort of thing in the past, because we have had this bias that we're the only complicated animals on the planet. It's just not the case. And that means that, if we as a species want to behave ethically, we have to recognize the significance of the information we're seeing about the complexity of other beings, and that the kind of harm that goes with not recognizing that, and depriving beings of that sort, individuals and groups, of the conditions that they need, not just for them to survive now, but for their children and grandchildren
Right.
to survive.
Right. And of course, the whole issue of what we're doing to the planet and climate change, those issues are coming to the fore because we are making it pretty impossible for human or non-human generations in the future to flourish. But, it's so interesting because what you're saying shows that traditional conservation just not enough. This notion of numbers. Oh, killer orcas are plentiful around the world. Bottlenose dolphins are plentiful around the world. This animal is plentiful. That's not the issue. The issue is the fact that the orcas in the Pacific Northwest are a different culture than the orcas off New Zealand or in Iceland. The bottlenose dolphins off the coast of Florida are a different culture than those off the coast of Australia, and so on and so forth, the beluga whales, etc. So that we do have to worry about individuals and individual cultures. It's not enough to just say, count the numbers of how many, members of a species there are around the world. We're talking about, if you wipe out a particular community of dolphins or whales, it's cultural genocide. That you're wiping out an entire culture that can never come back. And that's something that goes well beyond, any traditional ways of quantifying conservation. It's just another level that really has to be taken into account if we're really going to understand, what we're doing to these beings and who they are.
And see, from an ethical standpoint, to some extent, this gets very simple, which is, we say, well, okay, we can identify who's alive now. If you just want to say, well, we've had a dicey history. Let's just say, let's sort of give ourselves a pass. Say, we did the best we could. We weren't very good, but we did the best we could. So going forward, what do we do? So we can say, well, okay, we can identify what counts as harm. We can, sort of when we talk about flourishing, when we talk about the conditions that you need, beings of this sort need in order to grow, develop,
Mhm.
have healthy, happy, satisfying lives, or at least an opportunity for that. We can identify those conditions. And so we can say, okay,
Mhm.
how do we prevent harm from happening? Even if you just want to say, okay, let's, as I said, we forget about the past. How do we stop harm now?
Yeah.
How do we prevent harm from continuing in the future? And so when we then recognize, as we were talking about sort of basic rights here, right to sort of individual life, conditions, natural conditions that get left alone, culture, social interaction, and the like, we get to say, as Laurie says, it's not this issue of how many are there out there.
Mhm.
It's not a matter of talking about groups. We get to say, look, you wouldn't say that about humans. You
Right.
wouldn't say, well, we really do have plenty of humans, and okay, only the white colored ones will get a little special treatment and the others don't. We have a history of that too, but we're hopefully moving past that. But we'd never even say that about as it relates to our species, because we have this attitude that we're different. Well, we are special in certain ways, as all beings are, but we aren't unique. We're unique in the sense of being human, but we aren't unique on the planet in having individual consciousness, the ability to control our actions. I mean, Laurie and I have exchanged a couple of notes about this, but I mean, I think that, even an argument can be made for the fact, not just that, cetaceans have a kind of intelligence that's different from ours, but that cetaceans are more intelligent than humans. My definition of intelligence starts with, can you identify problems, threats to your survival, and can you provide solutions that make it more likely you're going to survive? And humans, we look at our behavior and say, global warming, trashing your own environment, overpopulating, killing one another with such a regular basis. And then you look at whales and dolphins. Okay, they've been around a whole lot longer, so we don't know what they did in their history. But I look at that and I say, we have species there that they solved the problem, threats, they came up with solutions, and to say, well, yeah, humans are special, and then maybe there are other folk on the planet that maybe we should give some consideration to. If you were a cetacean looking at human behavior, you'd probably say, I really hope they somehow get their act together, because they just aren't, they're just exploding the planet. And this is kind of a long way around, getting back to what Laurie was saying, that you need both at the same time, a very simple and a very sophisticated way of talking about the world and talk about beings. You say very simply, what counts as harm? And then when you get really complex and sophisticated about it, you can say, okay, let's talk about what are the conditions that are necessary that produced beings of this sort in different environments, with different traits, with individual societies, with different roles that have to be met. And that then make this focus very much on the circumstances of, different orca populations, for example, different whale populations, because this is what we have. This is what is there, and we can identify what conditions will produce harm to those individuals and to those groups. And from an ethical standpoint, I'm just a fan of saying, let's start with do no harm.
Right.
If we can just do that, we're a long way down the road.
And I think that's true. I mean, we identify, these 7 very fundamental rights. I mean, for these beings, and we violate all of them. Basically, we violate them in every which way. And one, I think personally, that we should be starting to think about concepts such as reparation. I mean, that's why we're doing creating the sanctuary. It's a form of reparation. It's not restitution, because we can't ever give back what we took, but we can make some reparations. in the form of sanctuary, in the form of ending practices that we know are harmful, that violate these rights. And, obviously one of the most egregious is the slaughter, the deliberate and incidental slaughter of dolphins and whales in the wild through various practices. And, I think also, and we'll take questions now, but I think also this concept of legal enforcement of rights, I think is extremely important as well, because obviously we need something more than what we have right now to protect these beings. Why don't we get to some of the questions, because we have a lot of questions here.
Sure.
And I want to make note that we mentioned this chapter on personhood that Tom and I just wrote. If you get in touch with me or the Whale Sanctuary Project info@whalesanctuary.org, we can send you information about that book. I just apologize, don't have that offhand, but we can get that to you. That book is out, and we can share that information with you. So let's see. And Tom, you can see some of these questions as well. There's some questions about whether or not dolphins in captivity, for instance, become echolocation deficient. And, this sort of gets to the notion of, what degrades when an animal is kept in a tank. Echolocation, but there's all kinds of things that degrade under those circumstances. One of the things we know about dolphins and whales living in tanks is they may use their echolocation less because there's less to echolocate on. I mean, let's face it, there's really nothing to do in a tank. And then there are also a number of different social skills that tend to become quite degraded and abnormal because they're in an artificial collection of animals. They're not in a natural social group, and they certainly don't have a natural culture. So all those kinds of things tend to change when they're placed in captivity.
And when you talk about echolocation, it's important to remember that's their primary way of perceiving the world.
Yeah.
And so when you don't use that, your perception of the world becomes flatter. There's less to perceive. Surely, it's like you don't develop the skill to fine tune how to perceive the internal, features of being. So, it's use it or lose it. And you have situations where there's no reason to use it, and we don't know what the impact is of using it in an environment like that, where you get all these echoes, and which it means that it may be uncomfortable to do that. And so part of it is that not just there's not an opportunity, but there's disincentives to use it because it's just not gonna make life better for you in a situation like that.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here from Fiona, which I was a $6 million question, which is, how can the dolphin hunters in places like Taiji and the Faroe Islands and elsewhere, other whaling nations, be persuaded that cetaceans have rights and should not be slaughtered or taken into captivity? And of course, that is a huge lift, right? I mean, that's among the most egregious ways that we violate these animals. And, everyone is trying to figure out, well, how do we get that to stop? And I wonder, Tom, I'm sure you've thought about that and sat up many nights thinking about, well, how do we get this stuff to stop? But is there a way, or are we just going to have to, well, let me let you talk about it.
Well, I think part of it is that with some of this, it's being driven financially.
Mhm.
So that then becomes basically a question of business ethics. I mean, the work I did, for years was in my official position was in business ethics. And one of the things you have to then try to do, and this was successfully done around the tuna dolphin issue and was successfully done with SeaWorld, you have to find the link. You have to follow the money and then find ways to encourage people who can have an impact on that to do so. Whether it's in Japan itself, where you then try to work with consumers, or any companies that are involved in this. You're talking about some version of the fishing industry. So part of it is that people have to be mindful consumers in the same way that everybody got on dolphin safe tuna. Part of it is it's just going to take time, because this is where there are, in my opinion, maladaptive features of human cultures that have this attitude of we can do whatever we want, we can kill whatever we want, and no other human can tell us what we should do, because that's then cultural imperialism. I mean, humans have a long way to go in having cultures that are universally adaptive and healthy. Certainly, any culture that assumes that it is by nature protected from being challenged by any other culture on the basis of ethical considerations still needs development. So these are things that I think it's just going to take time, but it does require consistent communication of the science and consistent looking out for ways where there are economic pressures that can be made primarily by consumers.
Right. And, by the way, speaking of the tuna dolphin industry, I mean, in no way has the killing of dolphins been, had ended through I mean, there are fewer dolphins.
Oh, yes, there are fewer, but it's still.
But nobody should be under the impression that the tuna dolphin issue is solved. It's not. There are still dolphins being killed by the tuna industry. So that's not a done deal. And that's and there always has to be some kind of a vigilance associated with these things, because if you hear, dolphin, you look on a can of tuna and it says dolphin safe. It's not really dolphin safe.
Yeah, it just means dolphin safer than it used to be.
Dolphins have died. Safer, perhaps. Fewer dolphins perhaps are dying than they were, but that's very different than what the labeling suggests.
And also the defense on all of that, it comes down to Laurie's point about numbers. It's it's a sustainable number for a community. It's like, okay, individuals don't count. I mean, it's how many members of a community can you kill off and say it's okay? Well, only way you can justify that is if you say these are not beings who have consciousness, awareness, self-awareness, and who count. The notion of one of the questions that was brought up, the notion of standing, legal standing. Well, moral standing is the same sort of thing. We as beings, the reason that it matters if you pick up a baseball bat and bang your neighbor over the head and somebody says, well, gee, you shouldn't do that, and we say, well, I don't care, they'll come back and say, well, I count. It's, well, I have standing, moral, ethical standing. These are being, you just can't do what you want. There are limitations on our behavior because of what other folk need. Sadly, as we see with the tuna industry and virtually every other thing in industries that relate to dolphins, they don't really recognize dolphins and whales as having standing as individuals. We see that with elephants. We see that in the last case of Happy the elephant. This becomes one of the major challenges that remain. We're making progress, but we still aren't seeing beings recognized as having standing as individuals, whether legally or ethically.
That's right. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think the work of the Non-Human Rights Project is so important, because although, there's moral standing, we need to take that and place it into an enforceable framework, legal standing. And, I mean, just as you said, I mean, the question of legal personhood for dolphins and whales is an empirical question, is a question about, is there evidence that these are the kinds of beings that are considered persons under the law, at least under the common law? And they are. Now we could talk about all different kinds of things, but in order to be consistent, if you're going to say that that human being is an autonomous being and therefore a person, and you have overwhelming evidence that a member of another species is autonomous, you have to recognize their legal personhood. Otherwise, you have to recognize the fact that you're going to gerrymander the law and you're just going to be speciesist and not be consistent. So you have two choices: be consistent or not be consistent with your arguments. And so obviously that's something that's extremely important to hold judges to.
Now, I just noticed a couple of questions from Stephanie Bird. I want to point out, Stephanie was the person who was responsible for Laurie and me getting on, space at the AAAS General Science Conference. Is like this was one of our big breakthroughs, and
That's
Stephanie
right.
was the person who was behind that, which I am hugely grateful behind.
Same here.
And she asked this really interesting question: other than components of communication like whale song, what are the elements of cetacean culture that are affected by human activity? Well, there are. Communication is one thing, but social bonding is another. Noise pollution is one thing as it relates to just being able to make your way through and avoid ship strikes.
Mm-hmm.
If we just talk about that kind of thing. But I've heard whale scientists tell fascinating stories about how the noise pollution dramatically affects what used to be an easy way for whales to communicate basically halfway around the globe using ELF. And so it isn't just then kind of smaller rituals of social interaction, which we might say is what's going on with whale song, but a broader sense even of belonging to a group. What is it like to be a being of that sort whose primary way of being being connected with others is sonic? With humans, it's mainly visual. Visual and sonic, we don't have a big range. But if you're a whale, and it used to be the case, what you're designed for is being able to communicate with folk halfway across the planet. What is it when that goes away? What is the psychological experience then of what your identity is, and then how you then bond and feel some kind of social belonging? Because they may be different from us in lots of ways, but in their own way, they're social beings.
Mm-hmm.
They're social animals. But I think that's a really great question, because it gets to the question of, okay, given a being of that sort, living where they do for so long, an amount of time in the evolutionary, how have the changes that we've made by being such an invasive force on the planet, what does that do then as far as the way that they can no longer do things? What's the impact of that?
And I think another example would be in ways that we compete for prey. Look at the southern resident orcas. They are highly endangered, and one of the reasons is because they eat Chinook salmon about 80% of the time. That's their 80% of their diet. And there are various things that we've been doing, putting up dams, fishing on Chinook salmon, that are making it very difficult for them to live. And it's not just a matter of, well, why don't they switch to something else? There's plenty of fish in the sea. That's their culture. They know each other as the Chinook salmon eaters, if you will. And so it's not very easy for them to just switch over to something else, just like there's cultural momentum in human species, and it's not very easy for us to make a change. Maybe take one more question.
Well, there's one I want to get to because it's a really good question. David Plord has asked, as Tom feels indebted to DRC on Marathon from his beginnings, how does he feel about them now? It's a really good question, which I've wrestled with. I have not had contact with people at DRC for a number of years. My feeling at the time was, well, they were better than other situations because it was a natural environment. It wasn't concrete tanks. I cannot, in conscience support captivity. I don't know enough about the situation, whether they're doing breeding. And I don't know, and I do know there hasn't been, at least I know a program of trying to reintegrate those dolphins into communities. I don't know how possible that is. To the extent that I feel comfortable with those kinds of situations, it's exactly what Laurie is doing with sanctuaries. I mean, at this point, I think the only ethical thing to do with dolphins, cetaceans that are captive, or find a way to put them in a situation where they can have the closest thing that is practical at this point to a decent life. And that's what Laurie is working on with the sanctuary. And I think whether you look at other sanctuaries for other animals, other non-human animals, that's the same thing. It's like, okay, for whatever reason, you just can't transition them into a natural habitat, but you can put them in a situation that's closer to a natural habitat where they can have a better life. But I think operations like this, like SeaWorld, you just can't see them as ongoing propositions that are good to continue.
Yeah.
Now, fortunately, SeaWorld ultimately, finally, and they aren't doing as well as they should. They finally saw that the business model wasn't going to work. If you look at SeaWorld ads now, they're much more showing they're an amusement park. I mean, we could have told them 20 years ago that's what they had to do. They did that because of business imperatives, because they were losing consumers, and but I do think that to the extent that, as I said before, you can exert economic pressure, operations of this sort, from an ethical standpoint, only if you view them through the lens of the kind of work that Laurie is doing with the sanctuary, you make a bad situation a little less bad.
I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, the sanctuary, an authentic sanctuary, not just a place that calls themselves a sanctuary, but a real one, is a form of reparation, and it's a way to do better. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. We don't think any dolphins or whales should be living in captivity, but is it a way I think of it as an exit ramp, in a sense, societally, from what's happening now, watching whales and dolphins jumping up in the air for entertainment and being bred, to a world where, nobody's in captivity for entertainment.
And I think that, it's not that we get a pass. It is true that humans didn't know enough about dolphins and orcas when we started this. We just got into this business way too fast. And with the consequences of that are, okay, you're responsible for the consequences of your action.
Yep.
You move too quickly. When you finally get the information about what the consequences of your actions are, you have a moral obligation to act appropriately.
That's right.
You just can't say, oh, well, we didn't know, then we're just going to keep on going. Well, yeah, we didn't know. We do now. What we do know now is we need to leave dolphins alone, and that the conditions under which they live in a captive situation do not allow them to flourish. And there's no way in which you can say, well, somehow there's some greater good being done. No, that's saying that the ends justify the means. And we wouldn't do that with humans. You don't do that with beings that are persons and not property.
Right. Exactly. I think that's an excellent way excellent message to end the webinar with. I cannot believe that over an hour has gone by, because I could talk with you forever. But I think that's a good message, and I thank everyone for their questions. And if we haven't answered them, contact me and let me know. Again,
let me say that as well. If any question anyone wants to follow up on, just drop me a line, twhite at In Defense of Dolphins, or any of the other. Just go to the In Defense of Dolphins website. Search me out. Laurie has my contact information. I'll be happy to continue conversations. Stephanie, if you're still on the line, drop me a line. I'm just curious to catch up and see. I live in Massachusetts now. I don't know if you still live here or not, but I've moved from, East Coast, West Coast to Massachusetts. So, as I said, I'm happy to answer questions, continue conversations. Please feel free to do that.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So again, and hi, Stephanie. Yes, I didn't realize, when I saw your name there. Thank you again, and thank you everyone for your great questions. And again, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Laurie.
Thank you. Be well, everyone.